So I think we'll give it a start. Most people now have made their way in. So thank you very much for joining us at the first of these Landmark Chambers Property and Quarantine website web series. I'm Justin Bates. Richard Clark is my co-presenter today. And just to answer an initial question, yes, this is what happens when you allow a 4-year-old to cut your hair. It provokes much laughter and is deceptively chilly. Just a little bit of introduction as to what we're hoping to talk about today and over the next few seminars. The plan is that we'd like to talk about big themes and topics that are going to be relevant to everyone after the coronavirus outbreak has passed. We wanted to use these webinar series to talk about things that you may have been wondering about at the back of your mind, or the things that are going to be becoming more relevant in the future. We can't avoid COVID-19, and there will be some discussion about COVID-19 in this, but this is really intended to be a slightly broader discussion of themes that affect the property market. So the first of our seminar series is a 4-part series on the private rented sector. This is the first one. There's one tomorrow and then 2 next week. And then after that, we'll be doing a second series about property and insolvency that will follow on immediately after the property series, the residential series. There are details on our website, on LinkedIn and Twitter and such like. If you haven't seen them yet and you want to sign up to any others, email the people that you emailed to sign up to this, and I'm sure we can sort you out. As to what this series is about and then this seminar, there are 17.4 million households in the private rented sector in England. It is now the second biggest tenure after owner occupation, overtaking social housing for the first time in about 50 years, some 2-3 years ago. And the regulation of the private rented sector is a political topic and on the political agenda in a way that it hasn't really been since 1988. So we wanted to spend some time looking at themes in relation to the regulation of the PRS. So this seminar is going to be about housing standards. And there's a little bit on the screen there about what we're looking at covering. The next one's about landlord licensing in England, parts 2 and 3 of the Housing Act 2004. The third one is about letting agents, and the final one concerns the enforcement of these rights. Now, each topic is about half an hour long. You are, as you might imagine, quite a diverse group attending these webinars. There's a mixture of local authorities, environmental health officers, surveyors, and solicitors acting on both of the main sides in these sorts of disputes. So what we're hoping to do is flag up some key points and then identify hot topics. There will be a level of generality to this, and if it transpires that you want more information, then please do feel free to email in or ask questions in your chat box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. We will try and take questions as we go along, but given that we are trying to stick to half an hour for these, that might prove tricky. What we are presently planning on doing, though, is collecting the questions that come in through the chat box, answering them and sending it out as an answer to everyone who attends these webinars. Now, that may just be a rod for our own backs we've created there, but that's the present plan. So this first one, then, is talking about the regulation of the private rented sector. And it's really going to break down into 2 particular standards-related issues. The first is the housing health and safety rating system, and the second is the wider myriad of mishmashing regulations that impose upon private landlords and their obligations. The way we're going to do these is Richard's going to take the lead, and I'm just going to throw some evil questions at him beforehand. He's had sight of some, but not all of these questions, so hopefully this works reasonably well. So, Richard, over to you. What is the HHSRS?
Thank you very much, and do be kind with the trickier questions, Justin. What is the HHSRS? Well, it's a rating system found in Part 1 of the Housing Act 2004. You go to Section 1 of the Act, and that actually explains what it is. It's a system for assessing the condition of residential premises to be used for the enforcement of housing standards, and it operates by reference to the existence of 2 categories of hazard, 1 and 2. And just to complete the picture of the bird's eye view of the Act, you find new enforcement measures in Chapter 2, emergency measures in Chapter 3, and then existing measures, slum clearance and the like, are dealt with in Chapter 4. Assess hazard the key point for the rating system is a system to identify hazards that arise from deficiencies. A deficiency is defined in the guidance as essentially a feature of the property that departs from the ideal. That can be due to inherent design flaws. It could also be due to wear and tear over time, for example. So take stairs or something. Either they can be designed in a way that's dangerous, there's no banister, or they can have become dangerous due to the treading, wearing on the carpet or something of that sort. The guiding principle is that residential premises should provide a safe and healthy environment for any visitor or occupier. One point made in the guidance, which is interesting, is that the guiding principle, to satisfy that principle, the dwelling should be designed and constructed with non-hazardous materials and be free from both unnecessary and avoidable hazards. The point that's made there is that all dwellings are in some ways of necessity hazardous to have the things that we want dwellings to have. And the examples it gives are electricity is obviously desirable in all dwellings, but it's hazardous even if perfectly designed and in perfect condition. So the system's not intended to bite against the presence of hazardous things that are in perfect working order and properly designed. Likewise, stairs are hazardous even if perfectly designed, but they're not caught by the rating system.
Sorry, Richard. No, just picking up on this. Who does these assessments?
It's the local authority, an officer in the local authority. It's usually the environmental health officer that conducts them. The methodology for how they do that is the subject of detailed statutory guidance. We'll come on to some lack of satisfaction with quite how technical the guidance is. But there's statutory guidance on how it's done and there's statutory guidance on enforcement, and they're both available on the gov.uk website. So that's the reference to the guidance is up on the slide. Fundamentally, what's provided for is an assessment of 29 conditions of hazard. To note, based on the condition of the whole dwelling, following a thorough inspection of the dwelling, and there's the paragraph reference to the guidance there. The point about it being the condition of the whole dwelling is that it's not simply a list of everything that's wrong with the dwelling as a kind of list of faults like a dilapidation schedule. Take, for example, damp and mold growth is one of the hazards. What's being assessed is how the multiple hazards in the property contribute overall to the hazard of damp. So it wouldn't be individual findings of each bit of damp. You'd ask, taken as a whole, what are the various items of damp? What's the level of risk they provide as a whole? There's a prescribed methodology that is fairly complicated, but for our purposes, you get a score that reflects the likelihood of harm occurring from a deficiency within the next 12 months. And then the spread of harms which might result from an occurrence. And then there's a statistical way of modelling that where you look at the likely outcome of tripping and bruising yourself versus a less likely but more harmful outcome of dislocating a shoulder. It's underpinned by statistical evidence on typical accident rates in houses and that sort of thing. You end up with a score, and then the score goes into a band. The justification given for having a band is that having an exact score for how dangerous some wiring is or some stairs are would appear to be would lack credibility because these are inherently uncertain exercises. So the score translates into a band. There has in fact been a review of all of this following a consultation in February 2019. 3 options were given, all of which were various combinations of try and make this a bit more straightforward. Option 2 is the one the government's plucked for at the moment, which is looking to combine some of these categories of hazards and reduce the number, refine the banding system to better reflect the inherent uncertainties in the exercise, and come up with slightly easier to follow guidance.
Do you know where that's got to? Because I mean, the government, that consultation is 2019 and the government responds 2020, and then there's the select committee were quite rude about the HHSRS guidance as well. Have we got any timeline from the government on when they're going to reform this stuff?
Not that I've seen.
No.
If people know, please do put in the chat box, but not that I've come across.
Can I just ask you one? Because we had a question come in before this started from someone who was very keen. A thorough inspection of the dwelling. Suppose you can't do a thorough inspection at the moment because of the lockdown implications. How does COVID-19 impact on your inspection?
It was a good question. I shouldn't put it that way. There will, I think, be some statutory contexts where it's quite clear that you don't have to actually physically be in the property to meet your inspection obligations. I think it really would have to be a question of statutory construction in any particular case. Under this rating system, the inspection powers in Regulation 4, Section 4, and then that does have a regulation making power to provide for how inspections are done. I did go and have a look at the regulations. They're the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, England Regulations 2005. All I could find was Regulation 5, which again just provides that there should be an inspection. Bringing that together, statutory question of construction, does inspection, should that be read as inspection in person? In this context, I think it's probably strongly arguable that it does mean that. And it goes back to the point you made, it's based on a whole dwelling inspection following a thorough inspection of the dwelling. Certainly arguable that that couldn't be properly done via some other means, photographs of the property, for example, or a virtual tour on the laptop. If a local authority was to try and argue that a virtual inspection was sufficient, you might also get a challenge about compliance with the guidance. So can't find a case that answers it one or the other, but I rather suspect in this context, inspection means in person, which does present difficulties in the current context. A point about occupiers, it's based on the risk to the potential occupant who's most vulnerable to the hazard. There's an extract from the guidance that technically means the assessment of the risk is occupier blind and done by reference to the most vulnerable occupier to that type of risk. Occupiers are relevant to deciding whether to enforce, and there's also provision made for modified assessments to take effect of overcrowding. So you come at last to the outcomes of these inspections. There are two types of hazard, category 1 and category 2. When you trace through the guidance, there's actually, I think, A to J scoring bands. And if you end up in a rating band of A to C, that's a category 1 hazard, and then D to J scoring bands are category 2 hazards. The important point is it's the category 1 hazards are the serious and immediate risk to health and safety. You find in section 3.1 of the Act, that's where the duty is to keep housing conditions in the area under review with regards to all of the other powers in the Housing Act. The section 3.1 duty, you must comply with any directions given by the Secretary of State. There's only one, it's the 2018 direction for ACM cladding. That direction requires local authorities to pay particular regard to the Secretary of State's evidence base on the risks of that cladding, identify all high-rise buildings within their localities, and carry out a review of the presence of ACM cladding in their areas. Where you've got a category 1 hazard, the important point for our purposes is section 5, you must take appropriate enforcement action. You've got a big suite of tools that are all set out on the second bullet point. The local authority must choose the one that's the most appropriate. And for these purposes, although you do have to pick one, emergency action followed by follow-up action does only count as one form of action. There is an interesting question about...
I was going to say, because logically this is two questions, isn't it? It's once you pass the 5.1 gateway of there is a category 1 hazard, the question is, one, what action do you take? And secondly, what content do you prescribe in the notice that you take? I mean, a prohibition order obviously stopped doing it. Where it gets very difficult would be, say, an improvement notice. If you decide an improvement notice is the right one to serve, you've then got to make a further decision about what the content of the improvement notice is. Have we had much case law on how you choose between the notices and how you choose what to specify in each notice?
There's been a couple of cases in the upper tribunal. I'll put the references in the paper we circulate later because I don't have them to hand. One case established the principle that the views of the occupiers are relevant. And there was a second case on fairly stark facts where what was proposed was an order that would essentially leave the tenant homeless to enable works to be undertaken. That the cost of those works was about £215, and that was deemed as a disproportionate step. So those factors can be fed in. There is a broader question, which is probably less clear, about the role of cost in deciding the relevance of cost to both of those stages. There is some reference in the enforcement guidance to the relevance of cost in terms of a prohibition order, but I've certainly not been able to identify any case law which really answers squarely the question of, is it a good reason not to serve something that the step taken is simply too expensive? So certainly thoughts on that from anyone watching gratefully received, but I've not been able to see anything. Category 2 hazards, where you find one of those, the local authority has a discretion whether to take action, and if so, what. Slightly different range of options, again, they're up on the screen. Again, you have to choose one course of action. There's a typo on the second bullet. What the sections make clear is that you may take additional action where the. In terms of cladding, I've put up a slide here because there is an addendum statutory guidance for cladding in particular. Confirms cladding is part of the exterior of a building. High-rise buildings over 18 metres tall with ACM do represent a fire hazard. That's now clear in the guidance. There is advice on the differing risks posed by the categories of ACM cladding, because not all ACM cladding is of exactly the same risk profile. It also depends what sort of insulation material is used, if any, but does confirm harm and the range of harm outcomes.
Can I just ask a quick question about the cladding?
Interestingly enough, yeah, please do.
Sorry, I was going to say, why are we doing cladding under the Housing Act 2004? Why are we not doing it under the Regulatory Reform Order? Ah, you've answered it. There we are.
Yes, I think that should be on one of my bullets. If you have a look at the final bullet on that page, the fire safety order deals with areas used in common by occupants of more than one dwelling, rather than the rating system, which refers to common parts. And the health and safety rating system catches exterior cladding. There is, I believe, a fire safety bill before Parliament that's going to rectify that and then make both statutory regimes catch external cladding.
Ah, okay, right. Thank you. You did answer my question. You beat me to it.
It's in the guide. It's buried in the guidance somewhere. Interesting point is that ACM cladding doesn't automatically mean you have a category 1 hazard. You have to have a holistic assessment. So, for example, you had a building which was otherwise exemplary, smoke alarms on every floor, centralised sprinkler system. You might then be able to say that the cladding as in and of itself didn't mean it was a category 1 hazard. Waking watches shouldn't be considered in the assessment. The reason for that is that they don't flow from the design and construction of the building, which is what the assessment's directed to. We've dealt with the common parts of the fire safety order. Just completing our whip through other standards, I've listed a whole load of others up on that slide, and we'll come to a couple of the more problematic ones in just a moment. Gas safety, this is an important one. Regulation 36, you must ensure that if you're a landlord that gas fittings and flues are maintained in a safe condition to prevent risk of injury. That includes yearly inspections, and for new leases, making sure you've had an inspection in the past 12 months, safety certificate. And that's then found in Regulation 36.6 is the record keeping obligation and the requirement to give your gas safety certificate to an incoming tenant before the lease starts. What are the sanctions if you don't comply with the gas safety requirements? There can be criminal enforcement, but it is, I think, very rare. I'm not aware of any cases. They're more likely to be a condition of your licence under the Housing Act. Also likely to be a condition of any mortgage term, also probably a condition of your buildings insurance. Section 21, you know more about this than me since it's your case, but It's also a requirement under Section 21A that you can't serve a Section 21 notice to terminate an AST on 2 months' notice. You can't terminate it unless you've complied with the prescribed requirements. The 36(6) requirement to give a gas safety certificate is one of those requirements, and is to do that before the tenancy starts. It's irremediable. So if you don't hand out your gas safety certificate before the tenancy, you can never serve a Section 21 notice. That's gone to the Court of Appeal. I've got a waiting from the Court of Appeal. Is that where we still are?
Yeah, we're still waiting for them to tell us whether I've won or lost.
Oh yes, and interestingly, recent change, a question about whether you served your gas safety certificate before the tenancy started has been added in to the into the accelerated procedure questions on the N5B claim board.
I thought that was really interesting. That the government just changed
COVID-19
N5B.
and gas safety. Yes. May need to change it back again.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah.
Gas safety. Interesting question. How do you check the gas safety during the pandemic? Will a gas safety engineer agree to go and do one? And if they were willing to, would the tenants actually permit entry? And it matters to the landlords because, again, complying with these things is probably a term of your buy-to-let mortgage as well as your insurance. Good question, if I can put it that way. It may be that you could go to court to enforce tenant covenants to permit entry to comply with statutory requirements, but I mean, expensive and time-consuming to do that, but I've not been able to think of any better way of doing it. And also the tenant may have a very good reason for self-isolating, be it a vulnerable risk group. Energy performance certificates, regulation 6, where buildings to be sold or rented, you must give your tenants a valid EPC at the earliest opportunity, free of charge, validate any Section 21 notice. I've not been able to find a case that actually firmly grapples with that. You could argue by analogy from the gas safety context, but the wording of the provisions is slightly different. So I flagged that up rather than coming bearing answers. Energy efficiency. 2015 regulations now mean that from the 1st of April 2020, you can't let a residential property, which is an energy rating of band F or G, and landlords who have existing leases must take corrective action immediately. There are various exemptions to that, where works would cost more than £3,500, and providing you've already spent £3,500, you can then register an exemption for whatever other works would be outstanding above that limit. Where the works of insulation would adversely affect the structure of the property, you get an exemption. Required consent can't be obtained. This is when the tenant just won't play ball. You get a 5-year exemption, or until such time as your tenant either assigns their interest or the tenancy ends. An unlikely scenario, but I suppose possible, would be where the works involve a devaluation of your property by more than 5%. And when you recently became a landlord, you can have a 6-month exemption. Final bullet there, relationship with the Fitness for Human Habitation Act posed the question, if you have bands above F or G, does that mean the property is fit for human habitation? Essentially, can you read one requirement into the other and say, reading those together, that anything higher than F or G meets the tests under the 2018 Act? Yeah, problematic, I suspect, but might be tried. Penalties for that, it's regulations 34 onwards. Compliance notices to give people warning and request information. Penalty notices, regulation 38 is the one to look at, and then there are financial penalties of between £2,000 and £5,000, and there's a right of appeal to the FTT. Forthcoming regulations, rented sector regs 2020. There's a requirement there, a 318A duty, to ensure that electrical safety standards are met. The important point about this is the way that those standards are defined is the standards for electrical installations in the 18th edition of the Wiring Regulations building standard. So as I read it, it's a duty to ensure that your electrical installations comply with the most recent building regulation standards. Now, it certainly may be possible, it seems to me, for there to be properties which were constructed well before 2018, that although they don't meet the most recent building regulation standards, are perfectly safe. Those properties would nevertheless, on the way these regulations are drafted, be in breach of the Section 318A duty. And then there's requirements for regular testing and a provision of report to a tenant within 28 days. There's various local authority powers. They're set out on the slide, and they can serve remedial notices. Landlords have to take all reasonable steps to comply. Non-compliant landlords can find up to £30,000, and there's also conditions in. That, I think, completes my whip through the housing standards. So I don't know if Justin, you or anyone else had any further questions. I think we'll address a lot of them in the.
I've been answering a few as you spoke, so as to try and help people as we were coming along. But remarkably, that has come in at bang on the half an hour we were looking for. This is possibly the first time in my 16 years of being a barrister that anything has ever finished on time. So I'm perfectly happy, as I think Richard is, to hang around for a bit and answer any questions that people want to share via the Zoom chat. Alternatively, we did choose this time because we're aware that many people have to get off and feed children. So if people do need to pop off, I can't see you anyway, but we thank you very much for joining us. If people want to hang around, then we'll try and pick up a few questions that are coming through in the chat. As I say, we'll circulate the chat answers afterwards. So give people a couple of minutes to decide what they want to do, and we'll see where we are. All right. What's the time limit to serve the certificate? Asks Wendy. It depends is the problem, Wendy. For Section 21 notices, there probably isn't a time limit. For Section 21 notices, it's probably the case that as long as you do it before the service of the Section 21 notice, you're okay. There's no actual law to that effect at the moment. That just seems to be the majority view of people that have spent their time reading the regulations. The argument is clearly there to be had, but as Richard said, the point is that they're written, these regulations, in a very different way to the gas safety ones. So the argument doesn't really arise in quite the same way. What happens if you don't carry out the electrical test at all? You can be fined by the local authority. It's one of the weird things about this. I don't know if Richard finds this weird or if it's just me, but we've got this really weird mishmash developing in the private rented sector between some things that are enforced by criminal sanction, some things that are enforced by effectively penalty notice, and some things that are enforced by restrictions on your rights to possession. And if you don't comply with the electrical safety standards in private rented sector England Regulations 2020, then the local authority serves a notice on you, imposing a fine on you. I think, where's my notes, trying to find it. You had this, Richard. What's the fine? It's up to 30,000, isn't it?
That's right. It's Regulation 11.
Yeah, that's right. There it is. It's a fine of up to 30,000, and then you appeal it to the first tier tribunal. But you don't appeal it to the first tier tribunal property chamber. Oh no, you appeal it to the first tier tribunal general regulatory chamber, which, given that the general regulatory chamber doesn't really know anything about property, is perhaps not the most obvious place to have put it. But there we are. Zed asks, what's the position regarding inspections due in June? Will landlords be penalised if they haven't inspected? So, as I replied to one earlier on in the chat column, I've seen some guidance from the government, non-statutory, so big health warning on this. This is just what the minister thought when he was having breakfast. Non-statutory guidance in which they say that they really don't think that there should be enforcement action for landlords who tried to get these things sorted out, whether it's gas safety or whatever, prior to COVID-19, but couldn't comply because of COVID-19. I think it'd be a pretty harsh local authority who took steps to fine you 30 grand if you could show that it was impossible, indeed possibly even unlawful, for you to access your tenant's property to do these checks. My suspicion is that there will be a de facto period of grace, even if no one ever legislates them. I think you'd need to be either a really slum landlord or a really aggressive authority to be looking to enforce at the moment, would be my view on it. Richard was just shuffling his papers. I don't know if he wants to add anything else.
No, I think the only thing I would probably do is have an audit trail of trying to comply, so that if you're questioned about it, you can show that you tried and failed rather than didn't bother at all. Other than that, I agree.
So Julie asks, if the landlord doesn't have an agent, they don't know what they're going to do, who's going to report them? Look, this could be naivety on my part, and I'm perfectly prepared to be told it is. But I would have thought this is a relatively easy one, the electrical safety tests, for a local authority to do. I mean, as Richard said, they've amended the HMO management regulations, so it's effectively always a duty of an HMO property to have these things as well. Local authorities, particularly in my experience in London and the other big cities, they're now reasonably good about doing inspections. I mean, they know where their worst bits of stock are. They know where the problem areas are. I would have thought they'll probably be able to do a fair bit of inspecting. Now, that does mean, if they only target the worst bits of their area, it does mean that bits that are bad, but not quite as bad as that, don't get touched on. And it does mean that people who might be renting property in very nice areas don't get their rights protected in the same way. But I suspect there'll be a decent degree of enforcement. Do private landlords have to carry out electrical compliance for existing tenancies from June? No, it's new tenancies from the 1st of June, but all tenancies from the 1st of April next year. So that's the change there. Yep. And then Jill asks, if the gas safety is run out and the tenants refuse access, can you still use Section 8? Yes, assuming you can get a ground for possession. The restrictions only take place on Section 21 notices. And that, at the risk of going off on a tangent here, that's one of the things that makes Section 21 abolition so hard, because the government's used restrictions on Section 21. Since the Housing Act 2004, they've used access to Section 21 as a way of driving up standards in the PRS. Don't protect your deposit, can't have a Section 21. Not licensed as a landlord, can't use Section 21. Not done gas safety, can't use Section 21. If you abolish Section 21, are you going to impose the same restriction on Section 8? You might do, but it's obviously a different consideration. If your Section 8 notice is because the tenant is trashing your property, is it really the case that you shouldn't be able to get possession because you didn't serve a gas safety notice? You know, the tenant is using the property to sell drugs or run a brothel or is conducting satanic worship and slaughtering goats in the front yard. Is it really the case that you shouldn't be able to get possession because of no gas safety certificate? I don't know. It's why abolition of Section 21 is much, much harder than people think. Sorry, I've just gone on, Richard. Do you want to say anything? Do you disagree with me? Anything there?
No, I was just thinking about it because you're right. I mean, basically, every time the government's introduced a reform it wants landlords to comply with, it's tied it to Section 21. You get the same thing for the tenant fees, for example. And if you tried to tie it into Section 8, I was just idly wondering whether you could do it for discretionary grounds but not mandatory grounds, or if you did it for mandatory grounds, would they then cease to be mandatory grounds? You'd have essentially, would it make all grounds discretionary? Difficult to think how it would work.
So, right, I think we should probably leave that there. Thank you very much, everyone. If there's any feedback on how this went, what you liked, what you didn't like, please do share, because we've got more of these to do. and it would be useful if there are anything we're getting wrong that we could fix it for the future. So thank you very much, and for those of you who are coming tomorrow, we'll see you tomorrow. Cheers. Bye-bye.